Thank you very much. So this is a case example and a reflection that we are having in our organization about what kind of data and how should we engage also young people directly into the research that makes up the evidence-based policy making in the youth sector. And this is a project that we carried out earlier this year. It was about narratives that young people brought forward apropos shrinking spaces for civil society. In just one or two words, so I work for this organization, which is a European umbrella organization. It's called the European Confederation of Youth Clubs, and we work with big or like national wide youth work organization, but also with smaller organizations, sometimes just youth clubs. So not always NGOs, sometimes what we would call uninstitutionalized civil society, informal groups of young people. So this is also what this project was in part about. I'm going to be talking, I'm going to give an overview of the project and what we did and how we were thinking about it, what methods were involved, and then I'm going to have some question conclusions. So this project about narratives of young people and their organization on the topic of shrinking space for civil society took place as a study session in March this year, and it was co-organized by our federation with Rural Youth Europe, which is another umbrella organization, mostly and the project was financed, supported, hosted, and assisted also educationally and in other ways by the youth department. The activity took place at the youth center in Strasbourg. The idea was to try to engage the storytelling aspect, or to try to anyway have a more participative approach to how young people think and conceive this phenomena, which is very complex and multifaceted, of the shrinking space for civil society. But we also want that all of our activities, or most of our activities, have this fun element to them, because this actually is important for young people, and sometimes we forget and we end up with results in some processes which are not so good. In the end, so following this activity, we also have a publication. I posted here the link with some of the contributions that were made during this activity, during the study session. About the project, so this was a week where we try to bring together young people, and we try to keep not just the fun element, but also a creative aspect, and try to ease a bit because it's a heavy topic actually to be talking about what is happening in your context in sometimes very oppressive conditions. So, and to be creative about it, it's not always an easy task. So we had, for instance, a game that was specially conceived. Maybe sometimes in the future we're also going to publish the game, which was a participatory, almost role-playing game about shrinking spaces for civil society. So it was not dedicated only to youth organizations, but civil society in general. There were also some, let's say, formal definitions, and we looked at tools like the Civicus monitoring report and others on how they should be thinking about the shrinking space. And we talked a lot about narrative formats. So what is a story? How can you tell a story? So besides this, participants were asked to think about the story, and the most maybe common example that we used was the hero's journey. There are many ways in which we can think and conceive a narrative. This is probably the most classic and probably the most wide used, and one that they are very familiar with because we gave the examples of Star Wars and Harry Potter and so on. But we try to ask them, can you think about your case scenario or your case story through the hero's journey? Of course, it doesn't have to have all of the stops, but it's a way of formalizing experience, and it's a way through which participants can share with each other experience. Besides having the discussions about what the story format is and having access to knowledge platforms and knowledge materials, there was always individual support provided for them all throughout the week. But what is important and worth mentioning about the way that we work is that we heard the stories only once. So at the not the last day of activity, the day before the last day of activity, we had one whole afternoon where the people who wanted to share their stories, they were ready to talk about it. We did not want to hear about the stories throughout the week. We didn't want to copy paste, tweak them, rewrite them. This was really very much up to the participants to do on their own. If they wanted to share certain aspects, or if they even wanted to talk about the subject of their story, they could. But mostly we said it's good that you do this individually and you focus on your story. And we heard the stories only once, which made for a very how should I say, for a very intense session, because you heard for the first time maybe specific things about somebody you just became friends with during the week, and what are the obstacles and challenges that this person is going through or has gone through. So this was a deliberate decision to give weight to the stories and also not to tire participants with oversharing and also on a sensitive topic. In the process of working with these stories and the story building, I think there were two let's say main conclusions about the process. First, that it's a very complex topic. So it's a very complex topic, and thank you to everyone who is investing in research and communicating results on the topic. We've noticed that even after a week of learning, people still had difficulties, let's say, correctly understanding sometimes. So there's this example of somebody who was working on a story about, she was trying to register her NGO, but she couldn't move beyond the idea of the fact that there's a lot of bureaucracy involved with her registering the NGO. And we try to explain, but the fact that there is bureaucracy, this does not mean that the space for civil society is restricted. It's restrictive in general, but are there any, let's say, recent developments that would indicate? But I think it's safe to say that it's a very complex topic, and it does take time to understand what is actually happening and how. And the second aspect, which was very important, was self-censorship. So we have had very few cases of people who shared their story with us, but chose not to read the whole story or at all in the evening where we did the sharing group. and also choose not to publish or to make public their story in any way. And we can very well understand why. There's very sensitive situations, and this has been the idea of sensitivity and sharing as an optional form of participation has been the topic all throughout the week. So people who felt comfortable with, they could sign in their own name, or they can do it anonymously. We also played with illustrations. So I think, yeah. Then what resulted is what could be further communicated, let's say, beyond the study session, beyond the activity, are these 12 stories and a poem. Somebody who did not, who wanted to go for a lyrical approach on things, so not belletristic was not his style. So we have 12 stories on and a poem related to rural and urban setting, some of which are ongoing situations apropos shrinking space for civil society and how it's impacting young people and their organizations. I have to say that our initial take on things was not as research, but we were talking about the stories as research, and we had a closer look in the group on also what could we understand from these stories, or what could we learn, because we feel that in the youth sector there are not enough frameworks. There is not a diversity of research frameworks. There is a, how should I say, wealth of methods through which we could just work with young people's narratives. So it's not just survey. There is discourse analysis, and there's a lot of discourse already just online. There's narrative inquiry, situational analysis. There are many ways in which we could work more with young people and the way that they perceive their reality or they talk about it. My method of work is constructivist grounded theory. So this is a qualitative research method. I think some of you are familiar or very familiar with this method. And I took I'm not going to go into methodological questions. And so I took some of these stories and we did constructivist grounded theory analysis on them. So we did, basically you have a text, and from the text you can develop codes. We did coding incident by incident, and then we look from the codes if there are any possible categories, but more data will be needed. And there were, because the research is not done, I can present two of the findings that I thought were interesting, or I can prioritize these two codes, codes that became categories. So one is that civil society is also a factor. When we talk about shrinking space for civil society, probably the most evident evildoer is the state or the government or some company, but also civil society is restricting sometimes space for itself. We had examples of, for example, there was a young farmer, and she says, not only am I a woman and very involved in farming and so, but I received death threats from like vegan movement and so on, because I'm raising cattle for meat. And I think she did a very good job about talking about the problematic situation that she is facing today with her Young Farmers Association. So I think this is something that we should also take into account, that it's not just gongos that are restricting, but sometimes just very well-intentioned civil society actors. And another category that came up from analyzing the stories was that there isn't something specific when people are aware that something is going on, but they say it's more like a sensation, because also nobody wants to be portrayed as a paranoid or a conspiracy theorist, I don't know, NGO leader, but they say there is something is already changing. We are not invited as much as we were. So until you get to a point where you can collect enough evidence that you say, yes, something is happening, my space for manifestation is being restricted, people have described this something more like a sensation. And I think here it's also very important that people continue sharing these stories, because by looking at other people's narratives, you can understand what is actually happening in your case. The same way that sometimes governments do, they learn from each other about how they could sometimes restrict the actions of civil society. Meanwhile, we moved on, and there is a second publication which has not was not produced in the space of this study session. It was produced on its own or for its own sake, funded by the Eastern Partnership program, and it is exactly on the same principles. Young people from youth work organization sharing stories about what they see is shrinking space for civil society in their context. And here we've just started a bit analyzing the stories. Though as I was saying, the project was not intended as a research project initially. We didn't start by gathering participants for a research project, but as they say in grounded theory, anything is data. So actually you have people who are coding just images, or you can do I don't know, posters, really anything can be data in grounded theory. Doing this project and also thinking about the stories as data has raised some questions for us, and many other are possible. One of the main is, could we have research methods that are more engaging for young people? Definitely, if you ask a young person, would you like to tell me about yourself, they're going to do that easier, depending also on the context, than presenting her with a 40-question survey, for instance. Could we also engage, maybe through stories, but there are multitude of methods. Could we engage young people earlier in the policy-making process? Usually, there's a lot of spending around elections, or maybe at the end of the policy-making process, when we have to implement something and everybody has to look busy that we're interested in this policy, but we didn't properly engage young people to begin with. So problematic and difficult, and probably cost more to engage them just like this. Could we have other data in youth policy making? So beyond qualitative, quantitative questionnaire, national data, statistic sets, which sometimes are not transnational or not so rich. For some context, also for the rural context, it's very difficult sometimes to fill in survey, and it remains, rural youth remains one of the under-researched youth territories in Europe, because they are very spread out, and this requires a lot of resources to actually, it doesn't work in the same way it would work in an urban setting where you even have organization and you can go for your target audience just by sometimes even making phone calls. We're also reaching, I think, a bit of a saturation. Apropos filling in surveys, I have nothing with surveys. I'm just taking this as an example, but I can also say that I was very happy, for instance, that this year we participated to 2 or 3 big research projects that the Commission was carrying out. They also did focus groups and other forms than just receiving a link and filling in a survey. We know it's the most economical, probably the most economical way of doing research. The question is not whether it's good or bad, but to look for more funding for other types of research that are more inclusive and engaging. Could we use data as narratives? And this would probably help also with the translation back into youth-friendly terms later on. And probably the most important question for us is actually the fact that can we accept that young people are experts themselves? Can we accept that they have an informed position from their lives and from where they are, and that these experiences can also be expressed through other forms of personal participation than, I don't know, something that's quantifiable. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't rush through the presentation.